Well, hello everyone, and welcome to tonight's Alumni Achievement Award event. My name is Meredith Turner, and I'm president of the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Association. In 1984, the UC Santa Cruz Alumni Office began honoring alumni who have made outstanding contributions to their field. These recipients are alumni who have rendered special and outstanding service to UCSC, or who, by personal achievement, have brought distinction to the university. This evening, we are honoring our 35th Alumni Achievement recipient, Stacy Jupiter. And introducing Stacy is our very own UC Santa Cruz Chancellor, Cindy Larive. As a first-generation college student herself, Chancellor Larive has long demonstrated a deep commitment to student success, inclusion, and equity. She is an accomplished bioanalytical chemist who came to UC Santa Cruz from our sister UC campus, UC Riverside, where she served as provost and executive vice chancellor. Prior to Riverside, she was a chemistry professor at the University of Kansas. And with that, please welcome Chancellor Cindy Larive. Cindy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Meredith, and welcome everybody. I must say, May 2021 is a little later on the calendar than any of us expected that we would be celebrating Stacy, when back in late 2019, we began putting together the pieces for our 2020 Alumni Achievement Award. But here we are. I'm just delighted that we've been able to stay the course as a campus and as a country in fighting this pandemic. And it feels just wonderful to be on the upswing again and to finally be able to talk about Stacy and hear about her work. I'm honored to be part of today's event, celebrating achievement of our students, staff, faculty, and of course, our alumni. That's one of the best aspects of my job. Some of you may have seen that UC Santa Cruz was recently recognized as the #3 public university in the nation for students focused on making an impact on the world. This underscores our reputation as home to people who are pushing for positive change. This recognition was a great honor, and it speaks to the students that we attract and educate here at UC Santa Cruz. But it's important to note that we have been attracting students with this focus for a long time. We are a place born of innovation that's long fostered a culture of excellence, inquiry, creativity, and public service. UC Santa Cruz is a remarkable university made up of remarkable people dedicated to making the world a better place. Case in point is tonight's honoree, Dr. Stacy Jupiter. Dr. Jupiter is the Melanesia Regional Director for the Wildlife Conservation Society based out of Fiji. Dr. Jupiter completed her undergraduate studies at Harvard and her doctoral research here at UC Santa Cruz and at the University of Queensland. Stacy became interested in community-based management and conservation while serving as a Peace Corps volunteer in the tropical rainforests of Gabon, Central America. Broadly, Stacy's work can be captured under the umbrella of integrated catchment to reef management. This involves evaluating the effectiveness of locally managed marine areas and assessing downstream impacts of catchment modification on biodiversity and on human health. More simply, she empowers local communities to develop effective strategies that conserve and protect the coastal systems they depend on for their livelihoods. Environmental advocacy is a key part of Dr. Jupiter's mission. Her work links the land and sea by considering the effects industries such as logging and mining have on coral reefs. She's shown how the rise in logging and mining have negative effects on water quality of the reefs and also increases the risk of transmitting waterborne diseases like typhoid. In 2019, she was recognized by the MacArthur Foundation for her efforts to save lives and reefs by building on an already existing research and considering new ways to manage natural resources. Our campus presents this Alumni Achievement Award annually, except when the pandemic intervenes, to a UC Santa Cruz graduate who has provided outstanding service to campus or through their achievement has brought great distinction to the university. Dr. Jupiter, your work exemplifies the vision and ideals of UC Santa Cruz. It's for these reasons I'm delighted to present to you the 2020 Alumni Achievement Award. So Stacy, this is the award. We're going to get it to you through the mail, but really excited to be able to present this to you today. So Stacy, we'd love for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chancellor Reef. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay.
Yes,
Thank you so much, Chancellor Reeve, and to you, Meredith, and the Alumni Association. Fantastic for this honor. Yes, I'm zooming in from Fiji, which is far away, and our internet is a little bit unstable here, but we're just going to go with the flow, as you know, everyone does all the time in Santa Cruz. After looking at the list of past recipients of this award, I'm truly humbled to be in their company. And I believe it's a huge tribute to the university that UCSC has produced an environment that fosters innovative, outside the box thinking that has inspired all of these people who have done such amazing things. And again, it's such a deep honor to be part of that list. For that in particular, I'd like to thank my PhD supervisor at Santa Cruz, Don Potts, who always encouraged me to think big and to span across disciplines. And through this, I learned how to build the right teams around me to address complex environmental problems. My time in Santa Cruz has shaped who I am today, for sure, and I'm forever grateful for the enduring connections that I made with friends and colleagues there. And lastly, I would like to thank my family for their love and support. My parents are out there in the cyberverse listening right now. Hi, Mom and Dad. And I definitely need to pass on my biggest and greatest thanks to my husband, Jason, who is right now chasing our near 5-year-old son around the house to keep him from disturbing me, but he may pop in at some point. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, what great words. Congratulations again, Stacy. It's a richly deserved award. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Ann Kapuscinski, Professor of Environmental Studies and Director of our Coastal Science and Policy Program. Dr. Kapuscinski will be moderating tonight's event. Ann is an interdisciplinary scholar committed to finding scientifically and socially robust solutions to major challenges, like perpetuating healthy aquatic ecosystems while sustaining resource uses that support human well-being. Ann, it's yours.
Thank you so much, Chancellor Larive. And I'm really excited to be part of this today and to hear what Stacy's going to share with us. I can promise the audience that you're going to find that her work is an inspiring example of science informing solutions on the ground and doing so quite directly, and them being solutions to a complex environment society problem, not just a simple problem. Tonight's discussion is going to focus on Stacy Jupiter's findings and the innovative planetary health approach that she takes to watershed management, combining nature-based solutions with water and sanitation infrastructure improvements. But before we get into that great talk, I would like to share a few details about how we're going to run the event tonight. We are using a webinar tool, so there is no chat function, but you will have an opportunity to pose questions and we will answer them at the end of the program. We may not make it to all questions, but we'll do our best to answer the questions in the main themes. And we invite you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and you'll find a little icon for that at the bottom of your screen. And tonight's event will be recorded. So with that, I will turn things over to Stacy. Welcome, Stacy.
Thank you so much, Anne. So I'm going to share my screen now, and you let me know when everyone can see. Is it up?
It's saying now we can see it.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Well, good evening, everyone, or whatever time it is in your neck of the woods. In my time zone in Fiji, it's just after midday on Wednesday, so we're nearly a day ahead of most of you in America here. And speak to you today. I had really wished to be there in person to be able to deliver this talk. It's been over 4 years now since I've been in Santa Cruz, and I miss it deeply. But I'm just so thrilled to be able to have this opportunity to speak to you. And before I get into the meat of my talk, talking about planetary health approach to watershed management, I just put up this slide to show you where I'm located sitting right now in the Fiji Islands. So it's about 5,500 miles southwest of Santa Cruz across the Pacific Ocean and the southwestern Pacific. So we're in the southern hemisphere here. We're going into winter actually, although as you can see, it's not very cold here. And I am located in the capital of Fiji in Suva, so on the largest island. Fiji is located just due east of Australia and due north of New Zealand. So today, what I'd like to do is take you on a bit of a journey, my personal journey of how someone like me who fell in love with coral reefs and was really interested in ecological and geological processes on coral reefs ended up getting involved in a case control study to identify risk factors for typhoid in Fiji. Now you heard about typhoid earlier, but you might be scratching your head and saying, huh, did I really hear that correctly? And yes, you did. And I hope that this will all make sense once we come full circle in the talk. So I've always been really interested in how ecosystems are linked to each other and how one action or disturbance in one ecosystem can have faraway consequences. And because of that, I've put up this image here of a butterfly in honor of the scientist Edward Lorenz, who was the first one to use the analogy of a butterfly flapping its wings, creating a tornado in a faraway location. And while there's not necessarily any proven evidence of the butterfly effect in terms of the butterfly's wings flapping, creating a storm somewhere else, there certainly is a lot of evidence that shows how an action in one ecosystem or a disturbance in one system can have faraway consequences. And one example of that, which those of you on the West Coast might be familiar with, relates to salmon. So salmon spend most of their lives in the ocean and they grow up eating other critters in the ocean. And so their bodies are derived from nutrients from the ocean. But then when they become adults, they have to go up to their natal watershed. And their carcasses then fertilize riverine communities. So the nutrients from the carcasses help fertilize the plants and create the food webs that provide the food for insects and for fish communities. So downstream, if people are overfishing salmon populations or fishing them in the rivers, this can have transformational aspects on the upstream watershed communities. So what I was looking at during my PhD research at Santa Cruz and subsequent postdoc work was actually looking at changes and linkages in the other direction. So how human activity in the watersheds can impact water quality, and then how that can have subsequent impacts downstream on coastal and marine ecosystems, in this case, tropical mangroves and coral reef systems. I had the opportunity while I was at Santa Cruz to receive a Fulbright postgraduate fellowship to the University of Queensland in Australia. And I went there to investigate how human activity in the watersheds of the Mackay-Whitsunday region has impacted water quality over time and had these downstream ecosystem impacts. And this is a view standing on a hill looking down at the sugarcane in that this region is known for. It's one of the biggest sugarcane growing regions in Australia. And then you can see the mangroves and out to the islands and the nearshore fringing reefs there. So with a great team of collaborators there, we were able to show this chain of events, starting from the earliest European settlers who cleared the forests that created changes in the sediment loads that were getting downstream. And then the subsequent agricultural expansion with the emergence of the sugarcane industry from the 1950s and how that changed water quality and how that was linked to downstream changes in mangrove and coral reef ecosystems. I stayed on in Australia after I finished off my PhD research, but I always knew that I really wanted to take the knowledge and skills that I had learned doing this to a more applied context for natural resource management. And in particular, I knew that I wanted to work with an environmental NGO. So an opportunity came up in 2008 to join the Wildlife Conservation Society, WCS, working with their Fiji program to implement an ecosystem-based management project. And they were working on Cumberland district with 10 communities on Fiji's second largest island of Vanuatu. So this is a photograph similar to the previous one from Australia, standing up on a ridge, looking down at the village of Natokalau and out to the coastal and marine ecosystems in Cumberland district. Now, in the conservation sector, where I've been working for the past 13 years, there are new buzzwords all the time. It's like an ice cream flavor of the week. And in the mid-2000s, the term ecosystem-based management, or EBM, was all the rage, particularly in the marine community. And in 2005, a scientific consensus statement came out on what marine ecosystem-based management was. And it was really encouraging people to try to take an integrated approach to management that includes the entire system, including humans, and really thinking at managing at the scale that species are moving between ecosystems throughout their life history and at the scale that impacts are being felt from different threats. Now, to me, as someone who had looked at ecosystems for the past 8 years, that made perfect sense. But to actually implement this in practice can be very challenging because managers tend to be very siloed, either within the sector that they're working or within the ecosystem where they're working, or even within single species management. And that sometimes has to do with very rigid environmental governance frameworks, particularly in Western countries. A perfect example of this comes from Australia. So the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, they put out a reef water quality protection plan, which sets targets that they want to improve the water quality draining into the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon. But the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority actually has zero jurisdiction and zero mandate to do anything about any of the activities that happen in the adjacent watersheds. So you can see that there's a disconnect and a problem there. But moving over to the Pacific Islands in Fiji, and where I work now across Melanesia, which includes Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu as well, there are real opportunities to more effectively implement ecosystem management within the context of the customary governance frameworks here. So Indigenous people in Melanesia have constitutionally recognized land tenure across 87 to 98% of all of the land in these countries. So that means that the landowners can make decisions about how their land is used and who can come in and use and access the resources. Customary marine tenure is also recognized in some of these countries. And if it's not constitutionally recognized, then certainly some rights for use and access in the marine environment are recognized. And this customary tenure boundaries are often particularly in smaller islands within this linked land seascape. So the local people actually have the ability to make rules and management measures that can perhaps cover the whole scale of the movement of different species, various threats that are happening in different parts of their land seascape. This is also supported by Pacific people's cultural practice. So Pacific people's cultural identity really depends on having access to natural resources that form the fabric of their cultural identity. And I really felt like this was the ideal photo to illustrate this. So this photograph was taken at a cultural show in the highlands in Papua New Guinea. And you can see in the costumes that these ladies are wearing that every single piece of material comes from the environment, from the bird feathers and their headdresses, to the animal pelts and shells on their necklaces. So in order to continue their cultural practice, they really need to still be able to have available all of these natural resources and species. That said, there has been a great commercialization of resources in Melanesia, from logging, from fishing, and through that process, as these resources have been monetized, there's been an erosion of these customary governance systems and traditional knowledge and practice. Recognizing this, though, we know that these customary governance systems form the foundation for sound natural resource management. So much of what I've tried to do with WCS over the past decade or more is try to maintain these cultural traditions and governance systems where they are strong, and where there has been some erosion of that traditional knowledge and customary governance is try to revitalize those practices, because this really forms the basis for local environmental stewardship. So jumping back to Cumberland now, when I first arrived in Fiji in 2008, what I was seeing that the WCS team was doing was not exactly what I would have considered integrated management in an ecosystem-based management context. working with the 10 communities of Cumberland district, they put together a draft management plan for a forest area. There was another draft management plan for a downstream marine protected area, and there was a separate draft management plan for the entire fishing ground. And none of these management plans considered how the actions in one area might impact the management activities in adjacent areas at all. And so working with a lawyer, we came up with a framework that would put everything together and allow simultaneous consideration of the management of the forests, the streams and rivers and the coasts and the marine ecosystems of Cumberland all together. And we brought representatives of all of the 10 villages within Cumberland district together, the men, the women, the youth, and we pulled in representatives from different government agencies and different civil society agencies to come together for some collective visioning on, first of all, what do the people in Cumberland want their lands and seas to look like for the next generation? And they told us, well, we want to make sure that we have ample natural resources for food and income, not surprisingly. They also said that they wanted to make sure to protect certain species that are really unique and found just in Cumberland and make that place really special. And then also importantly, they said that they want to be able to continue with their cultural practice, which depends on having a healthy environment base. And so given that, we helped walk everyone through, well, what are the specific things that people are interested in managing and protecting there? And then what are the activities currently going on that are threatening the things that they care about? And having walked through that process, we help local people see, well, what do they have the tools and knowledge and capacity to manage and do right now? And so those actions became the local rules that were put into the management plan. Going through that process, they could also see that there were certain things and certain threats that were happening that they couldn't control themselves. But through this process, we were able to define other measures and link them with the appropriate government departments or other agencies who could provide that support. And then everything got packaged together within the Cumberland District Ecosystem-Based Management Plan, which was the first district-level ecosystem-based management plan for Fiji. And this process now, WCS has subsequently replicated it in 9 districts in the country, as well as on 2 medium-sized islands where our teams have developed integrated island management plans. So that in and of itself was a pretty big achievement. But what I found over the 13 years that I've been living in Fiji and working across Melanesia is that while local people are happy to implement the local rules for the marine side in their management plans, they haven't really been changing their behavior on the land. And that's despite the fact that we have developed a growing body of evidence showing that there are major downstream impacts from their land-based activities. And I just want to show you a little bit of those right now. So another one of the first things that I did when I got to Fiji is that I started collaborating with my colleague, Aaron Jenkins, who was then running the Wetlands International Oceania office. And Aaron and his team had compiled a really large database of records of freshwater fish species from watersheds or vectors that were associated with loss of freshwater fish diversity and declines in the number of fish that he was finding in the streams. And what we found was that loss of forest cover was associated with reduced fish species richness and also fewer fish in the waters. And this was also associated with the presence of non-native tilapia that were introduced in the 1950s to Fiji. We found that these relationships varied seasonally, and in the wet season, in places that had more intact forests, like in Cumberland, it was actually a good thing. Having more water created more habitable space for these fish, and we found more diverse fish assemblages as well as more numbers of fish. But on the other side of the island, where the forests had been degraded and there was a lot of forest clearing also for sugarcane there as well, during the wet season, this caused a lot of sediment runoff to get into the waterways. The water becomes really muddy and we would find much fewer fish. The sediment affects these fish in a number of different ways. Some of the fish are visual predators. So with too much silt in the water, they can't see their food. Some of the fish like to settle on clean bottoms of rivers. And so if it's too muddy, they don't like that. Some of the fish need to get their food off the bottom. And if it gets smothered, they can't eat. It may be that the tilapia are eating some of the native fish, and also the tilapia themselves, they create their nests on the bottom. And in doing so, they can stir up more silt, making conditions worse. The fish that were particularly sensitive to all of these changes, the most sensitive are ones that have a life history characteristic that we call Amphigemus fish. And these are fish that are born in freshwater and they have to go out to sea as larvae, and they spend a few weeks out at sea and then they come back upstream in a mass migration. And these fish include things like large gudgeons, which can be plate size and make a really good meal for people living in these inland communities in Fiji and other tropical high islands. They also include some species of gobies. They can be caught and they're considered a delicacy, and they actually sell for very high value. So I think at the time we were doing this research, they were selling for about $50 US a kilogram. So this is helpful for earning income for local communities. At the same time, we were also interested in looking at what were the impacts on downstream water quality and coral reef communities, particularly in places where there's been a lot of logging, like in the Solomon Islands. So in the Solomon Islands, commercial logging accounts for about 18% of government revenue and at least 60% of the export revenue. But the consensus is that pretty much most of the forests are already completely logged out. And so it's not necessarily going to be economically viable to be doing this in the future, but they keep going and they keep logging. And this is largely due to the fact that there's pretty weak central governance in Solomon Islands and the industry is very poorly regulated. This particular photo was taken in on the weather coast of Vangunu Island in Western Province. And this is one of the last remaining intact ridge to reef corridors in the entire country. And that's due to the fact that the local community of Zaira has very strong customary governance system, and they have vowed collectively to try to protect this area as much as possible because they know that their livelihoods, their health, their cultural practice depends on access to these resources. But you can see that there's been some encroachment from loggers who are trying to get into the area, and that's creating this plume of sediment that's coming down their rivers and getting out to the reef. So we wanted to have a look at what was the impact of this type of logging. And we focused our work looking on a different island, also in Western Province in Solomon Islands, called Kalamungara. And you can see Kalamungara, the top of the island, rising from the mist here. It goes up to about 1,700 meters, and Kalamungara has some of the last intact cloud forest in Solomon Islands. They call these the Sky Islands because there are these patches of intact forest that are very few that are left in the country. Now, the name Kalamungara in the local language means water lord or water god, and that's because these forests are capturing water from the clouds and the cloud forests and sending it down these 80 streams that go around the entire island that provide the clean water source for the 6,000 residents of the island. So we wanted to have a look at how would that water be impacted if these intact forests above 400 meters were cleared. So working with a number of collaborators, we looked at various different scenarios of logging and various amounts of clearing of that area. And we also wanted to see if it made any difference if the logging went kind of as status quo, where people are just doing whatever they want as right now, or if they were actually obeying this best practice standard. What we found was that when the land clearing got to about 40% of that forest area, it didn't matter whether you were using best practice standards or not. The drinking water downstream, the quality would be compromised based on the amount of turbidity that would get in the water, the amount of sediment, and that would exceed the safe drinking water guidelines from Australia and New Zealand about 40% of the time. So again, this is some compelling evidence that people need to think about what the actions in the watershed and how to manage them to not compromise the safety of their water. We also wanted to look, as I said, at the impacts to the downstream coral reef communities. So we did this in both Fiji and Solomon Islands, and we were looking to try to relate the amount of land clearing within the watersheds to water quality, getting out to the reef, and the amount of sediment that's being delivered, and relating that to what's being found on the reef in terms of the amount of coral and the structure of the reef and how that relates to the types of fish that were present out there. So we found in both Fiji and Solomon Islands negative effects on the coral reef habitat due to sedimentation associated with land clearing. And this was in turn having effects on different groups of fish that people really depend on for food and income. So in Solomon Islands off Kalamungara, it seemed to be particularly affecting grazing fish. These are fish that help keep the reef clean by scraping off turf algae. And people there, in their catch, it's about 25% of their catch is grazing fish, and it's also about 40% of what they sell. So you can see it has an impact on what's going into their mouths and how much money is potentially going into their pocket. We saw similar results from Fiji, just with different groups of fish. The fish that people most like to eat, these big piscivorous fish that eat other fish, and planktivorous fish, these large ones, plate-sized ones, those are the ones that were most compromised. And so was, again, resulting in loss of opportunity for food and income. So armed with all of this information, we've been doing our best to try to communicate it back to all of these landowners and decision makers so that they can change their behavior. And this is a photograph where we were presenting back some of the results from the sediment modeling on Kalamungara to different landowner groups. This was a meeting in 2017. We were meeting with some of the key landowner groups, including some of the chiefs, to try to get their endorsement to start a project to establish a protected area for the forest above 400 meters. So as a result of this meeting, the good news was that they gave the green light, and we've been working ever since and doing landowner consultations to try to establish this protected area. I've also tried to get really creative to reach out to different segments of the population to try to get these environmental messages across in ways that may be more entertaining, where people don't even realize that they're getting environmental messages. So a few years back, I got some funding from the Disney Friends for Change initiative, and I worked with a very talented local artist to develop comic books. This one in particular, The Adventures of Joji Gobi, told the story of a precocious goby named Joji that went downstream, and then he missed his mass migration back upstream. And as he made his way back up to find his family, he encounters all the different hazards that one might encounter in a watershed that's heavily modified by humans. I also worked with another local artist to make puppets of all the main characters, and then our staff trained up as puppeteers, and we took this on the road. We took Joji and his friends on the road, and they were a big hit. We went to 5 schools in rural Vanuatu, the second largest island, and the kids had never seen anything like this. Working with the teachers, we appointed in each of the schools some Gobi youth ambassadors and gave them these river care kits with monitoring checklists of indicators that they could look to see whether the adults were actually respecting their rules. And what we heard from the teachers was that, you know, the kids got it right away, and they got these environmental messages. One of the head teachers told us that after the presentation, one of the kids came up to him and said, Teacher, your gardens are planted too close to the river. You and the other teachers need to move your gardens. So that was great. It made me really happy that we were able to get these environmental messages out to the next generation. But the problem is these kids are still too young to be part of the decision-making that's happening right now. And there's some urgency because forests are being cleared at alarming rates, particularly in Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. And this is a photograph from Kalamungara after that meeting in 2017. Despite the fact that the landowning group said that they were committed to this forest protected area, some logging has still gone ahead. So, you know, really, I've been scratching my head and thinking for so long, well, if fish aren't going to convince people and dirty water isn't going to convince people, what's going to convince people to change their behavior? And so the first moment where I started thinking about alternative ways to convince people to change their behavior came back in 2009. And I was coming back from a vacation in Hawaii. And as the plane descended from the clouds to the Nandi International Airport in Fiji, this was basically the view from my plane window. And I said to myself something like, oh crap, but you know, it's probably a little bit more coarse than that in my head, because I knew that I wasn't getting home that night. But you know, my problems were really small compared to the 8,500 people who were left homeless from this flooding event, as well as the $150 million worth of damage to infrastructure that this flooding caused. And what was more insidious was that what we started to see following this flood and then subsequent floods over the next few years in 2010, 2011, and 2012 is that 2 to 3 months after these flooding events, we would see these peaks in waterborne bacterial disease incidents in Fiji. And we seem to notice that anecdotally, they seem to be occurring in areas where people had done a lot of modification to the watershed. We were getting this data because my colleague, Erin Jenkins, his wife, worked very closely with the Ministry of Health. So we were able to have a look. And you know, this was a real watershed moment for me and Erin. And we thought, wow, well, what if it's some of the same factors that we know are causing impacts to downstream freshwater marine ecosystems that are also related to the spread of typhoid and leptospirosis? Wouldn't people be more likely to change their behavior? And so we got together and we created this whole idea for a concept to be able to look and see what are there environmental factors that are driving the spread of these diseases in Fiji. And at the time, WCS was leading this initiative called HEAL, Health and Ecosystems Analysis of Linkages. And they had put out an open call for proposals for concepts to be able to demonstrate that with the same management actions, you could get win-wins for public health and the environment. So out of over 60 proposals that were submitted, concept ideas, ours was one of 5 that got selected to go pitch at the Moore Foundation in Palo Alto in 2011 with the Moore Foundation and a variety of other donors. And unfortunately, we did not get funded at the time, but both Aaron and I thought that this was too important to let lie. And Aaron had not yet done his PhD. So he closed up the Wetlands International Oceania office and he moved his family to Australia where he enrolled in a PhD program. And I became one of his co-supervisors to try to see if we could uncover any environmental determinants of typhoid in Fiji. And what we found, and this is how we started getting involved in this case control study of typhoid in Fiji, is that we found that the factors driving the spread of typhoid are happening at a variety of nested scales. And so to really be able to tackle this public health crisis, we have to be able to be looking at management at a whole range of different scales. Particularly this part of the Pacific and Melanesia have suggested that we are going to be more likely to get more intense storms and more rainfall during wet season. And that has played out, and we've been seeing that. And so that increases flood risk. And we know from the work that Aaron's done and from other studies that these water-related diseases are correlated with the amount of flooding that's occurred. And so in order to tackle this, we need to arm the negotiators that are coming from the Pacific, that are going to the climate negotiations with this information so that they can really say that they need to convince basically the governments of other countries to take more aggressive action under the Paris Agreement so we can, keep our Earth's climate system in check and limit these flood risks in this area. At the landscape level, what Aaron's research showed was that there are certain factors within the watershed that were related to incidence of typhoid. And these were things like the amount of fragmentation and loss of forests, particularly along the streams and rivers, as well as the density of road networks within the watersheds. When you get into the interior in Fiji, most of the roads aren't sealed, they're just dirt roads. And so where the dirt roads cross the creek, that serves as a point for sediment to get into the waterway. And we think it's possible that the sediment, and also with nutrients around, could be forming a site where the bacteria that cause these diseases could settle and then get into the water that people are drinking or onto the food that people are eating. There were a number of factors that came out of the case control study at the residential or village level that was related to the spread of typhoid, things like poor drainage in the village, the way the water was stored, poor people planting gardens just downstream from leaky latrines. And so we need to tackle this with infrastructure interventions. And we're also trying to work very closely with the Ministry of Health to improve health surveillance so we know where these diseases are coming out, because that's been very poorly recorded in Fiji. There were also factors, unsurprisingly, that came out of the case control study that people's behavior was influencing whether or not they were at risk of getting typhoid. And that's things like not washing your hands or not washing the vegetables from your garden that's planted just downstream from these leaky latrines. So in order to tackle this, we need to get messages out through campaigns. And of course, we're aided by this right now as we sit in the middle of the COVID pandemic, where there's a lot of messaging going out about hand washing. So that's going to be helpful for these other water-related diseases as well. And then lastly, at the cellular and microbial level, there are ways that we can be increasing immunity to some of these diseases. When we first presented this work, this idea at the Moore Foundation in 2011, we got a comment back saying, well, there's a vaccine for typhoid. Why can't you just vaccinate everyone? And yes, there is a vaccine for typhoid. It's only gives you immunity for about 5 to 10 years, and it comes at a cost. And a lot of the residents in these rural communities in Fiji and Melanesia, they don't have the money necessarily to get the vaccine, and the vaccines aren't readily available in Fiji. The government hasn't been investing in them. Since I've been here, there's only been one typhoid vaccination campaign a while ago, and in fact, it wasn't all entirely successful because of some issues with the cold chain, which obviously has some lessons that need to be learned as Fiji tries to roll out vaccinations for COVID right now. So given this evidence base that we've accumulated, we have now put together a big project that we are calling the Watershed Interventions for Systems Health in Fiji project, or WISH Fiji. And this has been ongoing since 2018. And it's funded by both the Australian government and Bloomberg Philanthropies Vibrant Oceans Initiative. So unfortunately, we never could get a single donor to fund this work. And we tried ever since that 2011 pitch at the Moore Foundation. And many donors were interested. They thought that the idea was really innovative, but they would say to us, well, we have a health program and we have an environment program. And it doesn't fit nicely into either. So we can't fund you right now. And that's unfortunate. Now, these days, more and more, I'm seeing more donors who are more transdisciplinary in their thinking, and there are more funding calls that would be able to fund this. But back in 2008, when we got this funding, Erin was able to raise money through the Australian government for public health applications. And we were able to leverage that through WCS's proposal to the Bloomberg Philanthropies Vibrant Oceans Initiatives, which is really focused on coral reef health. And we put this together because we've been collaborating so long and we've had this idea so long that we overlap these projects geographically within 5 river basins in Fiji. And collectively, this was a challenge because we had 2 different teams. We had to bring them together. It was a lot like herding cats. We had to develop a whole internal governance structure about how we could work and communicate with each other. But now we are all on the same page and working towards 5 main goals. The first and most important one being to try to do this integrated, holistic watershed management in a planetary health context to try to reduce the incidence of disease. So water-related disease, typhoid, leptospirosis, and also dengue we're focusing on in this project, and also reduced disease in the environment. So in coral disease that we're seeing in fish downstream. Secondly, we're working to empower local communities to access and maintain their fundamental human right to clean water. Thirdly, as I talked about in the beginning, we're trying to strengthen people's connection to their environment and connection to place by incentivizing that this will help ensure their cultural practice and their identity going forward. Fourth, we're trying to improve health system surveillance and work with the government to make sure that there's better disease tracking. And then lastly, from my perspective, I want to make sure that this isn't a one-off pilot project. And so a lot of what we're trying to do is trying to develop ways so that we can mainstream this approach so that the government is not reactive to outbreaks, which it has been in the past, but is actually taking more of a preventative approach to this kind of preventative medicine by environmental management. So we've pulled all of this information together in terms of developing some key messages that we can take back to the 29 different communities and villages and settlements that we're working with in these 5 river basins. We've been working with a local communications NGO to help visualize some of these key messages, to help tell people about how they're using the land and how it's causing problems, and also how poor hygiene and sanitation infrastructure and habits within the village can also affect the health. And then we're providing them with different options about, well, what can we do about it? What can we all do about it together? And what can we do at these nested scales? And so these messages have been taken back to all 29 different communities, the villages and settlements, as well as baseline data that we've collected on risk factors at all of these different scales. And we've walked these communities through a step-by-step process of developing a water and sanitation safety plan. And through that process, we arrive at different priorities for management interventions within the watershed. And some of those priorities are nature-based solutions, so things like protecting the forest or restoring areas that are degraded, whereas some of them are more related to infrastructure. So in this case, we put in a new water tank, water reservoir, and that's providing clean water to all of the households downstream in that community. So given all of the events in the past year, sitting in the middle of this global pandemic, this work has started to feel a lot more timely. We had this idea long before the pandemic, but what I've seen coming out during the pandemic is that a lot more studies have been coming out that are showing relationships between human modification of the land and emerging infectious disease and outbreaks. And so, as countries and governments and communities start thinking about how do we build back better, my message is that we really need to be thinking about how do we better manage our environment, both for the environmental outcomes we want, but also for our own health and for our planetary health. So I've reached the end of this journey. I've gone down many, many twists and turns and all sorts of rabbit holes. I've had the opportunity to collaborate with a huge number of incredible people, local people, indigenous people in Melanesia, excellent researchers from other institutions. And, it's just been a fantastic opportunity and to be able to share all of this with you. And I'm going to stop there and say thank you very much. It's been a great honor and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
That was great, Stacy, sorry. Let's see if we have any questions in the chat box. It looks like we do have one. What you are describing in Fiji sounds similar to what has happened or is happening in Haiti. Would the lessons learned or being learned in Haiti also apply to Fiji? And you might want to even think of it in the other direction. Oh, I think you froze, Stacy.
Yes, I believe so. Can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you now.
Okay, good. Sorry, our poor internet connection in Fiji. Haiti is a similar kind of environmental setting to Fiji, and then it's a tropical high island with these tight connections between the watersheds and the linked downstream coral reef and coastal ecosystems. I would say the differences in Haiti are that the state of the ecosystems right now are that they are much worse shape. There's been a lot more land degradation, both of the upstream watersheds as well as the coral reefs. And so it's at a more difficult starting place for management. And as opposed to in Fiji and Melanesia, we're looking at more protection, which is easier and costs less money. In Haiti, we need to be, in places like Haiti, need to be thinking a lot more about restoration, which is a little bit more complicated.
Right. And we have another interesting question actually from one of my PhD students, Alyssa Takesi, who's from the Federated States of Micronesia. And I may not pronounce this correctly, but I'll try. She starts off by saying, Bula Vinaka Stacy, congratulations on your award, and Vinak Vaka Levu for the wonderful presentation. And her question is, in being creative, how did you overcome working with our local community's island time speed to mobilize on environmental and or extreme events?
Thank you so much. That's such a fantastic question. I think from my side, my experiences in the Peace Corps in Central Africa really helped me adapt to island time in Fiji. What I learned from living in a remote community in the middle of the rainforest in Gabon is that things happen on their own time and you need to be flexible and you need to be patient, and you also need to plan for the unexpected, and you need to plan for things to take about 5 times longer than you think it's going to take. And so I've brought this attitude with me to my work with WCS in Fiji, and a lot of the challenge of this has been more on the communication with our funders and our donors who expect things to be accomplished in a much shorter time frame than it can be accomplished, given that you need to allow a lot of time for consultation and deliberation with local communities, because it's really all about them making their decisions, and you don't want to push that decision from the outside.
Right. Another question refers to collaboration. This person specifically mentions that there was another British NGO volunteer group that was in Fiji and also was working to provide clean water and build clean water systems. So the question is, do you work with other groups that are working on similar projects so as to save on resources and collaborate?
Yes, absolutely. We definitely try to collaborate as much as possible. If that's the same organization that I'm thinking about, that is possibly one of the ones that's overlapping in one of the watersheds where we're working. And so, yeah, we bring everyone into the discussions and decision-making to make sure that we're not duplicating effort. That's really important.
Okay. And there's one question that I'm going to broaden a little bit. As I was listening to you, I found myself thinking, I really love the concept that you said towards the end of your talk, and also the way you worded it, of preventative medicine by environmental management. And, you know, that sort of seems to really be the kind of one of the key take-home lessons. So I was wondering, you know, it would be great to hear some more from you about your vision for how this could spread beyond Fiji to really become the dominant way of not only managing our environment, but of taking a preventative approach to human health. And there is a question from one person that's sort of related, asking you, have you looked at non-tropical areas? How do you think your approach might apply to salmon fisheries, for example? So I think it's kind of along the same way. Like, how could you take this whole watershed approach and think of it as, you know, a preventative medicine that's actually going to be really good for humans as well as for the environment?
Yeah, thanks, Anne. So, yeah, I mean, one phrase that I'm hearing a fair bit in the circles that I run in right now is environmental management as a vaccine against the next pandemic. And I think that environmental management, you know, as I said, preventative medicine, it's going to be part of the solution, but it's not necessarily going to be all. We really need to be taking a systems approach where we're dealing with the environmental side and making sure that we have good environmental state, but we're also improving our health systems in terms of surveillance, diagnostics, treatment, and our vaccination capacity as well. So I think we need to look at everything together really holistically to make sure that we're preventing the next pandemic. In terms of how we take this beyond just a project or a single approach in Fiji, you know, I've been, as I presented to Anne's students in the master's program earlier this year, we've been thinking about how we can create these sustainable financing mechanisms so that there is a supply of funding for this. And part of that is to try to identify, well, what are, you know, in the places where we're working, what might be the healthcare savings cost if people aren't getting sick? In these rural areas in Melanesia, it mostly ends up being the government who pays for the healthcare costs because people don't have health insurance and they don't necessarily even have a lot of money to pay for hospital visits or any sort of treatment. So the government ends up paying for it. And could you end up saving money by making these strategic investments? And if we can show that there's kind of a positive cost benefit relationship, then the government themselves should be willing to put into a fund, and then we could leverage other public and private investment so that this becomes a mainstream practice and we're not just waiting for a project to come along and do that. So I think this works in this type of setting in terms of tropical environments and looking at these water-related diseases, but I'm not so sure how applicable this particular chain of thinking would be in non-tropical environments where people are getting their water from treated municipal sources. You're not necessarily going to have the same chain of logic where people would be convinced at watershed management because it's saving on healthcare costs. But I have heard about other water funds that have been set up in other parts of the world in temperate places as well, where the downstream users are paying for upstream watershed management because it's regulating both the supply of the water that they need, maybe to run their businesses downstream, or, you know, it may be protecting some fisheries, and they're also paying for the quality of that water that's coming down.
Okay, and then there's another question that's sort of along the same theme. This person was also congratulating you for your inspiring work, which I hardly agree with, and was asking what plans are there to ensure long-term sustainability of this work, either by the communities or local government after the project is over. So it sounded like you were talking about establishing this government fund, but it'd be great to have you dig a little more into the details. I'm sure that's not a very easy thing to do. You know, what are some strategies that you're using?
No.
Help make that possible? I can imagine that the government of Fiji isn't like, you know, endowed with a lot of money. So part of it is sort of, changing people's mindsets about what they should prioritize. So talk to us about the sausage making of trying to make this happen.
Yeah, exactly. So I think when I spoke to the students last year, it was, right, I had this idea for how this could be operationalized, and we've now packaged it into a proposal that is going to get funded. So now we actually will have funding to go through these steps that I hope will convince the governments to make this a reality. And I think the first step is to be able to quantify, well, how much disease risk can we reduce by these different strategic actions, and then what's the healthcare savings, as I said. So develop this kind of business case for why it would be favorable to develop a watershed fund. And that's how we could get the government on board. And then at the same time, try to develop some tools to be able to help people prioritize where to invest. So looking geographically at where the geographic places that have the highest risk and the best opportunities for return in terms of win-wins for public health and the environment. And then another tool based on everything we know about how these ecosystems work and how disease ecology and how it's transmitted is, once you identify that place based on the characteristics of that watershed, what is the best type of intervention to do when you get there? Is it infrastructure? Is it sanitation? Is it planting trees? What is that? And so developing these tools will go a long way to helping people take this on board. This new money coming in is going to give us the opportunity to go through those steps and then be able to have the meetings with the government in Fiji, and then also take this approach to Papua New Guinea and Solomon Islands. In Papua New Guinea right now, we already have a contract where we're working with the government there to set up a national trust fund. So that's already in the work. So we have the building blocks. So I think, this isn't going to be easy, but I think that we have some of the building blocks in place to make this a reality over the next few years.
Great. So it sounds like you already are also expanding it to other places. That's great. Another question, which I'm sure won't surprise you, is on the theme of climate change. And the question here is, how might climate change, including sea level rise, affect the issues that you're dealing with and the watersheds on these islands?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned in the talk, some of the big climate impacts that we're seeing here is this increase in the intensity of cyclones. We were hit in the past 5 months by 3 major cyclones, a category 5 cyclone, and then a 2 and a 3 that had devastating impact in places and caused hundreds of millions of dollars of damage to infrastructure. There were outbreaks of water-related diseases after these events. And so that is going to continue to happen, and that is going to get worse. And that creates big risk for these communities. And, for a category 5 cyclone, you basically are just dealing with the recovery side of that. There's not much you can do on the environmental management side to buffer that, but environmental management could potentially buffer the impacts of a category 3 or a category 2 cyclone. In terms of flood risk here, there is an added flood risk downstream that is related to sea level rise as well as to degradation of coral reefs from climate change impacts related to coral bleaching. So your coastal ecosystems, your coral reefs, your mangroves and the seagrass, they can buffer some of the wave energy from storm surge. So you end up in these tropical high island settings getting a double whammy during these storm events, where you have all these floodwaters that are running off the watersheds, particularly in cleared and modified watersheds. And then at high tide, you get these storm surge events, and they all back up in the floodplain, and they create a lot of damage and cause a lot of risk. So what we need to be thinking about doing is, as much coastal protection as we can, whether that's protecting the ecosystems or even hardening where appropriate of the shoreline to prevent the storm surge damage, as well as the environmental management to do our best to try to buffer these impacts. But we also just need to be ready and know that they're going to happen and be ready to respond.
So it sounds in the way you answered that question that you were really talking about taking a systems approach also to adaptation to climate change impacts that we can't stop from unfolding at this point.
Yeah, that's right. In a fund like this that we're thinking of, these national funds, they could also provide funding for recovery as part of adaptation in this. They also could be incorporating things like insurance payments, right? So if there was a, say, for example, a downstream resort that was downstream from this watershed, it might, people have talked about cases where the business might be able to get reductions on the premiums for their flood insurance if they're contributing towards environmental management, be it at the coastline or in the watershed. And so that could also feed into this type of watershed fund.
Yeah, that makes sense. You have another question from someone who was interested in the modes of transportation that you use to do your work in the reefs and the watersheds. And I think she was interested also in this in terms of the kids, the youth that you engage in some of this work.
Yeah, sure. In terms of transportation, I mean, some of the sites we can get out to by car. A lot of the sites in Solomon Islands, you're in boats, open boats with outboards. A lot of the local people you would have seen in the photograph from Columbungara Island, they're just paddling around in dugout canoes. And that picture was actually the kids paddling to school. So they get their own dugout canoes and they paddle to school every morning and then they paddle back multiple kilometers. So transportation is a challenge, and getting resources out to people in these remote locations is really a challenge. And by resources, I mean, anything from fuel to knowledge and awareness, because they are so remote.
At the very beginning of your talk, or at least pretty early on, you mentioned that you were finding that the indigenous communities were quite good at maintaining or revitalizing their customary practices in the marine environments. And I assume you were implying that the customary practices tend to be more sustainable than practices that they may have been imported from other places. And then you went on to say that, however, they weren't doing this on the land. And of course, that was part of the motivation for the work that you've done. But it would be really interesting to hear from you. What have you come to learn are the main drivers of them not wanting to change their behaviors in land management to go back to more customary practices? And is that also part of what you need to do in the systems approach, is to understand those barriers? And are there ways to overcome them that can maybe enhance or complement the work that you're doing that's really focused on the disease prevention?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. That's interesting in that I could give an entire other talk about the effectiveness of the customary rules and management in the fishing grounds. And that, that's a whole nother topic entirely. And some of that works okay, and some of that doesn't work as well. But, the issue that's a little bit different on the land is, I think that because local people are the landowners, they can cash out basically by leasing their land for these commercial extractive ventures, so logging or mining. And people get starry-eyed when they see the amount of money and put that in their pocket, because these are very cash poor people. They don't have a lot of money, and so that money all at once can look like a lot. But when you look at it over the long term in terms of the loss of ecosystem services, it doesn't necessarily add up as being the best decision when you look over time, if they've compromised their water quality, if they've compromised their food sources as well. And so that we're trying to get people to change the calculus of those decisions.
Great. And that actually segues to another question that just came in from a person saying, "Great talk, Stacy." And they're curious to know if you had any interactions with the logging companies. Have you run into conflict with that industry, or are these companies involved with these ecosystem-based management processes that you're putting in place?
Yeah, so there is one logging company in particular that we've been working with on Columbungara, and they're actually a Forest Stewardship Council certified company. So they're certified as being sustainable, and it's actually due to their efforts that most of the forest that is still left on that island is still intact, because it has to stay intact over the areas where they have their lease in order for them to maintain their certification. And so they're a great ally and a partner for this, and they offer a lot of employment to the local communities there. In other cases, a lot of in Solomon's and PNG, it's a lot of Malaysian logging companies that maybe don't necessarily have all the right paperwork. And it's in fact quite dangerous to try to go onto the area where they've have their logging counts. So we can't necessarily directly engage with them. In Fiji, the logging companies have been more friendly, and we've gone to chat with them, especially just to get maps of where their concessions are to help the local communities do some planning about where land planning, about where they would manage. And to develop sustainable management plans. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of where we are and which companies we're talking to.
Okay. And I imagine that the local people are also using a fair amount of the land also to grow some food. So to what extent are you drawing upon approaches of agroecology? And again, they may be more customary farming practices to also support these the watershed management approach that'll help reduce disease?
Yeah, thanks. We've just been getting a lot more into that, in particular in Fiji. We've just signed an agreement to cooperate with the Ministry of Agriculture so that we can work together on improving sustainable agricultural practices. So again, you're getting a win-win. Soil conservation is a win-win for water quality as well as for agricultural productivity. And so we're trying to transmit these messages in terms of what agricultural practices will keep the soil on the land and make the land more fertile and productive and keep the soil out of the streams and waterways.
Yeah. So I want to ask you sort of a big picture question, especially since you mentioned at the beginning that your advisor told you to think big. So if we were having this conversation 10 years from now, what do you want to see in place in the world that's essentially been the scale up of this kind of work?
Yeah, thanks. You know, I think it would be nice if there's a lot more awareness in general about, you know, when people are buying products, where they're coming from and making sure that they're being sourced sustainably. A lot of the timber products that make their way to America, or, you know, palm products are coming out, and they're coming from countries where these practices aren't being done sustainably, and people aren't necessarily aware of that. So if there's more awareness from that side, there can be a real sort of business and financial push to increase the accountability and sustainability of the business practices that are happening, the extractive practices that are happening that are affecting the environment. So I would like to see more willingness for companies that this isn't a hardship for them, that it actually becomes you know, financially profitable to be shown to be doing sustainable operations. And ultimately that's going to be for the benefit of everyone.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting answer. And it makes me wonder if it was possible with the sustainable certification to tell the story about that direct connection to human health, whether that might increase consumers' willingness to, you know, buy those sustainable products and to understand what sustainable means. As somebody who works a lot in sustainability and education and sustainability science as a whole, I like the concept because it's all encompassing, but it also can be difficult then for people to connect with it because it is all encompassing. And it helps if there's something very tangible that they can understand will be a benefit if they support, you know, buying products that were produced sustainably. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, having personal stories attached to the products. I've seen some of that lately. And, you know, when I look at it, I have an immediate connection with the product and the people that they're sourcing it from. You know, right now that FSC certified logging company in Solomon Islands, unfortunately, the buyers of their product go on and they're not sustainability certified. And so they're doing all of this work and they don't even get the benefit of getting a premium price for their product. And it's all become sort of, what's the point? So I would like to see them recognized for the good work that they're really doing in terms of protecting the forest there, and by opening up markets for that.
And what do you think is the main obstacle right now to them not getting recognized? I mean, what's making it hard for them to get certification or to have that clear signal in the market?
Well, I mean, those other companies, I don't know. I guess there isn't a business reason to, it's not financially profitable for the other companies that are buying the products to do that.
Mm-hmm. A very different kind of question that you got from one person is, what are the coolest animals that you see in the ocean in the area where you work?
Fantastic. Yeah, I have this chat all the time with my son, and I'm just, completely chuffed that he loves all of his marine creatures. And so all the time we talk about, the turtles that we see. We have named our boat after the white and black banded sea snake, sea crate that we see out on the reef, which is called the nakulabi in Fiji. And we see that all the time, and they're always swimming up to my son. So they're pretty cool. We see lots of rays. There are manta rays here in Fiji. There's dolphins. There's humpback whales that come to have their babies in the sheltered waters coming up this time of year. They'll be here soon. So yeah, the marine environment in Fiji is phenomenal and very inspiring. And I've been inspired because despite all of these global changes that are happening and changes in Melanesia and changes to the watersheds, we still have healthy, intact coral reefs here. So that gives me some hope that all is not lost. And we still have the opportunity to protect the things that we care about.
Great. I'll ask you another question that's more sort of looking back, but then helping to counsel current students and future students. Given that you've ended up in this work where you're dealing with human health and the environmental connection, you probably didn't anticipate that when you were doing your graduate studies. What advice do you have for students who, and this is true of undergrads and graduate students, I think that the current generations of students in higher education are really acutely aware of the rising crises. The pandemic has really sort of exacerbated it all, but we have climate change impacts that are spreading throughout the world. We know we're running out of time to lower carbon emissions. We have a biodiversity crisis. We have a really important reckoning with racism and other forms of discrimination, and the need to step up diversity and inclusion. And there's a sense of running out of time, and yet people also understand that a lot of these issues are interconnected. So what are your thoughts about, thinking back on the way you were educated? Do you have any advice to current students to be better prepared to lead in these areas?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my one piece of advice, and it's something that I followed, although no one told this to me, but was just not to necessarily pigeonhole yourself into being the expert on any one thing, but to really be open to knowledge and understanding, and just trying to learn whatever tools you need to learn to be able to address the questions that are of interest to you. And that certainly was my case. I always fought against even staying within the confines of one discipline. So moving across disciplines, I had to learn about remote sensing and using satellite technology. I had to learn geochemistry to get these long-term water quality records going back 100 years plus. In Australia, I've had to learn social science because everything that we do in the management world is all about kind of behavior change and working with people and their perceptions. And so I'm just to be open to new ways of thinking, new ways of knowledge, new ways of doing, new technologies, and that will help you find the solutions.
That's a great answer. Really, really, really delighted to hear you say that. And I think students hear that from some of their professors now, but it's great to hear that from somebody who's been out there in the field and having real impact on the ground, and being recognized with this really awesome award. So I don't think we have any more questions coming in. I could stay here all night and talk with you, but I also don't want to take people too far away from probably on our side of the planet needing to maybe have dinner. But this has been really a fantastic conversation with you, Stacy, and wonderful to hear about this amazing work. And I hope we can touch bases with you again in a few years, if not sooner, to see where this goes. And, for me, I think the takeaway phrase was that one, preventative medicine by environmental management. I look forward to seeing that on the banner of a WHO website at some point, and have it become a really consistent way that we think about doing environmental management and also health insurance, et cetera. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And thanks, Stacy, for zooming in all the way from Fiji and sharing with us a little taste of this amazing work. I hope everyone takes away from this the message that taking that systems approach and being open to new ways of thinking is just incredibly powerful, and that we all are going to need to mobilize as much of that as we can going forward to solve the problems that face us in the world. And we can solve them, and we can actually improve conditions for the environment and for people. So Stacy, you really make all of us at UCSC incredibly proud. We think we should give you a hand at this point for this award. It's such an amazing thing, both the Alumni Achievement Award and the MacArthur Fellowship. And I need to tell people about an event coming up, but Cindy, do you want to say anything more here at this point?
Yeah, I just wanted to say congratulations again, Stacy. What brilliant work you're doing and so impactful. We're just really proud of you.
And
thank you so much.
And you're getting a lot of thanks in the Q&A also. So please know that you are admired and loved on this end of the planet, Stacy, and come back and visit us to campus when you finally can do it. And all the slugs will be really happy to see you. So I want to also just give people a heads up that we welcome you to join us next week on June 1 for a university forum leading humans in the 21st century with Dean Alex Wolf and UCSC alumnus and veteran Silicon Valley-based engineer Michael Lopp. And with that, we'll wrap up the evening. And thank you again so much, Stacy, and huge congratulations to you.